Right, good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to the second at the moment of the STA Tools talk series, which are at this time every Friday. There's a whole schedule coming up of further talks around topics like JavaScript, GitHub, code spaces. So, you know, you are all welcome to come along. We'd love to see you. They're aimed at you guys getting started, helping volunteers get active on volunteer teams a bit quicker and filling in some of the gaps that people have. So some of them may be a recap and some things you may learn a little bit more. I will share off the back of this the kind of full schedule, but most of the talks are on Eventbrite. If you follow us on Eventbrite, you're automatically notified when we add stuff, so that can be quite useful as well, almost like a watch. So a very warm welcome to Dougie, who has done a number of projects with us, has seen us warts and all, and you know, has been integral to helping us get a lot of the development environment in an easier to use, quicker to get started space. And Node.js is common across quite a few projects at the minute. So, you know, thank you for offering to help and go through this. Over to you, Dougie.
No worries. Thank you, John, for having me. Yeah, so like John said, I'm Dougie. I think I've worked with most of you. Any if I haven't, I'm involved in quite a lot of projects, and they are mostly sort of Node.js, generally speaking. Yeah, so cool. Let's get in. We'll get started then. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about Node.js, and this is an introduction for designers, Scrum Masters, and the permanently baffled. So it's quite low level, and it's more of an introduction to why we would want to use it. If you've got any questions during the presentation, please just stick them in the chat. Joanna will keep an eye on it and then let me know, and we can leave them to the end. My hearing's not very, very good, so it's just better if we get them in if everybody's okay with that. Cool, so what we're going to cover today. So we're going to have a look at what Node.js is. I'm going to run through the classic hello world example, talk a little bit about the sort of things you would need to be aware of, either as a Scrum Master or designer, or even really just as a new developer. And then we'll go through any questions you've got. Cool. So what is Node.js? Node.js is an open source, asynchronous, scalable, event-driven JavaScript runtime. Yep, so what does that mean? Well, don't worry about it, we'll get there. But let's think about, first of all, what we actually do in the STA. We develop mobile and web applications. So what does that normally involve? Well, typically we're going to have some code running on a web browser or a phone, and we're going to have something in the back end doing something or other. So how do we talk to each other? Well, really, when you think about it, web applications, just normal applications, you've got something running on a local computer, and you've got something running somewhere else that does all the sort of heavy grunt, the heavy lifting. And that's what's typically known as the client-server architecture. So you've got your client, and that's just, in most of our use cases, is going to be a web browser or a mobile phone, tablet, that kind of thing. And you're going to have your server sitting on the other end, maybe in the cloud or AWS or whatever system we're using. Your client's going to make requests to the server, and the server is going to give replies to it. It's not much more complicated than that. That's really all it does. The server just responds. However, the problem is that the server and the client use different languages. So almost everything that we work with will be JavaScript on the client. Whereas on the server side of things, it could be pretty much anything: C#, PHP, C++, and quite often Java. And this is what you usually have in your team split up as front-end development and back-end development. So that's the crux of the problem, is basically we've got two completely different languages. So you need to have two different sets of developers, which is slightly more difficult to manage than other bits and pieces. So our use case is typically the back end is relatively simple. There's not an awful lot going on. It tends to be storage of data, retrieving images, making requests, storing data, nothing overly onerous. We also tend to very, very heavily focus on our user experience. So we have a lot of front end work. Most of our volunteers are coming to us from courses that teach JavaScript. JavaScript makes it really easy to develop for web and mobile at the same time. So there's a lot of advantages for us to try and focus on JavaScript as a language, because we can write something in JavaScript and we can run it in a browser, And relatively, in most cases, just by running the same code in a different type of browser running on a phone, we can have the same code. So we can write once and we can run it in lots of different places. And of course, we like to reuse existing solutions. And that's another thing that JavaScript is very good for. JavaScript as a language does have an awful lot of limitations. It's not very strongly typed, for example, and it's very easy to, it's quite loose with how it defines things like variables. So it can understand a string in one context, so a list of letters in one context, and in another context could see that as being a number, and it could convert by the two sort of on the fly, which can lead to a lot of problems, a lot of bugs. So we often have to expand it with things like TypeScript that will sit on top of JavaScript. But the real benefit of JavaScript as well is that it's open source. Well, the majority of the modules are open source. So any code we write, we could reuse on other applications. So we don't have to keep redeveloping the same thing. So the answer is really, would it not be a lot easier if we could just use the same language on the front end and the back end? So wait, what was that about mobile web development? Yeah, that essentially on web and mobile, the way the code runs is really straightforward. You have a container sitting inside your browser, and it takes the JavaScript code that you write, and it passes it through something called the Google V8 engine, and it turns it into microcode. And then the microcode runs on the computer. So effectively, at the top end, on the left-hand side, JavaScript is human readable. On the right-hand side, your binary output is readable by the computer. Oh, I'm clicking the wrong button, my bad. So that makes sense. The computer understands what's going on. Node.js does exactly the same thing, but it wraps the V8 engine in C, and so it's run on a server. So exactly the same way that we're running code on our browsers or mobile phones, we can now run code in exactly the same way on a server. But it also adds a couple of things as well. It allows you to read and write to files. It allows you to connect to databases, and it can serve content. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you develop an app in Node.js. That functionality is already baked into Node.js, and it does it quite well. So if we go right back to the start with the big long blurb that nobody got, what is open source asynchronous event-driven JavaScript runtime? Open source is just the source that the code's available for, and we can read it, and we can update it, we can expand on it, and we can see it. Asynchronous are processes that run independently of each other, and that's quite important in the context of Node. So an asynchronous process is just something, if you split a job up into lots of little jobs, it doesn't matter in what order they run. It just matters that they all run at some point. So that's an asynchronous process. And Node is very simple in how it deals with the asynchronous processes, which means it's very efficient on a server, especially in network applications. Scalability is just that you can increase the capacity to demand. So the more people are accessing it, it can still cope with it. It's not going to fall over. An event, a change in state. So event-driven software reacts to changes. And if you think about the kind of stuff that we develop, most of our stuff is event-driven. So you've got an app sitting on your phone, and it's got a current set of state. User does something, adds some text, press the button, whatever. There's this change in state, and that's how it reacts to it. And lastly, JavaScript runtime is really simple. It's just something that runs JavaScript code. So the long and the short of it is Node.js is something that runs JavaScript code on a server. So it meets our use case. It allows one developer to use a single language to manage both your front and back end. Anybody got any questions at this stage? No, fantastic. I'm now going to try, we'll run through a quick tutorial. So I'm just going to do now is we're going to do the classic hello world example. I'm going to use code spaces for this as well, so we can minimize the amount of setup you've got. This is the bit will probably go wrong because I'll need to switch to something else. Brilliant. Okay. So hopefully you can now see a screen with code spaces on it.
We could, and now it's gone black for me.
Okay, cool. Let me just stop sharing it and reshare then. There we go. Hopefully you can see a web browser now.
Perfect.
So if anybody that's not used CodeSpace before, CodeSpace is just it's like a shared environment. It's on GitHub, and until recently you had to pay for it, but GitHub opened it up about a month ago so that you can get so many hours. It's about, I think it's 40 hours a month in development and up to 4 machines running at any one time. And all this does is allows you to have a virtual machine running in the background that's already configured with like pre-existing templates. So I'm just going to run through the whole world using the default template. Look how quick it is. It's not. It's just it is very, very quick to develop on. Give it a second for it sets up to the connections. So this is all running on the server as well. So even if you're running on something like a Chromebook, it's not really going to matter because it's the actual grunt of what's been done has been done remotely. So this is quite useful for development. Cool. So there we go. We're all connected, and we've got a terminal running in the background. We're going to create a file, which the default file that we tend to use in most Node apps will be called app.javascript. And we're just going to create a variable which says world. We're going to send the output to the console. And that's that. There you go. That's as simple as that. So we've put the code in there. That's your JavaScript. And going into the terminal, we've just run it by passing it straight through Node. So you can see that this is literally what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes or so, is that we've got some JavaScript code and we've passed it through Node. So you are running JavaScript code on a remote server. And hopefully, so there you go. That's the long and short of it, is it allows us to run code remotely. There's a lot more stuff it can do. So we'll run through some other bits and pieces. I'm just going to switch back to the presentation if that's okay. Cool. So the first thing I have a little chat about is a thing called the Node package registry. So NPM is built into Node itself, and it's a central repository that allows you to store or to share any code that you write. And some of these can be quite small. So if it's somebody who's had like a very special use case, so somebody needs to design something like a date picker, they can write a date picker, register it with NPM, and then other people can just access it, download it, and have it available in their code. Or you can have things that are really quite in-depth and quite complicated. So for example, a common package is something called Express that allows you to build whole web page type frameworks. So we'll demonstrate that as well so you can see how Express works. I have to keep changing screens because that's where I put the code. Okay, so we could do this exactly the same thing. So stuff in CodeSpace. So what we're going to do is we've been on the registry, and I need what I want is that we'll start a new application, and we're going to install a framework. So the framework we're going to install, we've already found it in NPM, and it's a framework called Express. And all you have to do is just install it, and off it goes, and finds it, and that's it. It's built into your project straight away. So you've now got access to the library. You can do whatever you need to do. If you want to create a new app, one of the big advantages as well of this, again, it's another reason people really heavily use Node.js, is there are some quite in-depth frameworks. So for example, on the volunteer app project, we've started moving across to a framework called Native-Base, because Native-Base has already got integrated components that you would want to use. So if you want to create a button, there's a Native-Base component for that integrates and theming, dark mode. You can change colors very easily. You can set everything uniformly across the entire app. There's lots and lots of frameworks available, and almost all of them are open source. Some of them are not, but the majority are. So you can, if you know the kind of app you want to start, you can just start by creating like a scaffolding or a boilerplate type code. So we'll do that now. Sorry, I'm just moving on screen a little bit. Oops. Okay, so what we've got now is that. So that's the framework itself installed, and we've installed something that generates just an extra bit of software, which is going to allow us to create a new app, basically. And we can do that now. So Express. So all we're doing now is we've installed Express Generator, we've installed the Express framework, and we're going to run the Express Generator app, and we're going to create a new app. So these are based around themes, and this particular one is called it's called Pug. That's quite something in Pug, and that is it. That's you. You've now got a complete framework that you need to start your a basic web page being served. So you can see that this wasn't here before, but on the left you've got all your folders. The application itself, this is stuff that's all very standard, things like error handlers, catching 404s, serving the web page, all that sort of the code that's never really going to change, or if you are going to change it, you're going to adapt existing code, and then we can just run it. The next thing we'll do is we'll just do a quick npm install. So what this does is it goes away and looks at any dependencies that are in that boilerplate. It locates them in the registry and it pulls them all down. There we go, right, straight away everything's in, it all runs, and then we just have to run the application itself. Might take a minute or two for it to start working. Yeah, there you go. This is another thing about CodeSpace is really, really good. So I'd also advise it for your teams generally, if you get the chance, is that one of the things that it does very, very well is that anytime that your code creates a web link, so like serving a page, it automatically deals with all the port forwarding. So you can just, as you see, we run that, it's created a port, and we can just click a button and it will connect to the right port. There you go, nice basic application. So all it's doing is we've created a basic boilerplate that serves a single web page with a header that says Express and some text that says Welcome to Express. So although the output itself is really quite simple, you can still see that in really only a couple of seconds, we've been able to install an entire framework and get an application up and running on the server side of life. And for most of your projects, that server code is always going to be fairly consistent. So we can do things like we can get connections to the database set up, which is probably the most common use case. And then your front-end developers can just carry on developing, and you don't really need somebody separate to be looking after the back end because it's still just JavaScript. So your front-end developers can spend, if there's an issue or something you need to change or adapt, they can go in and adapt it, but you don't really need somebody to be permanently sitting worrying only about the back end. And if you think about it, that's generally a major problem as well. So if you've got a back end that's written entirely in Java, and you've got a Java developer who spends their time looking after a server, which doesn't really need any looking after, and you've got one poor person sitting doing a bunch of JavaScript, it's not a great distribution of your time and resources. Go back to share presentation. Cool. So you've seen, we've got an idea of what Node.js is. It's really straightforward. It's just something that lets you run JavaScript on a server. We've had a look at a hello world example, and we've looked to create some boilerplate. So we'll just run through a couple of sort of catches, and these are quite general. They're not major sort of gotchas, but they're just things you need to be aware of, especially if you're like looking to pick this for a project. The first thing you'd be aware about is that Node.js comes in two versions. There's what's known as a long-term support version, which is currently 18.13. That gets updated every 18 months. There's a second version, which is called currently 19.5, and that gets updated every 12 months. So by default, Node.js will install as the current version. So if you're using CodeSpaces in particular is current. It is sat in current. It doesn't even install the LTS version. This isn't a major problem. It depends on what your timescales are for your project, and it depends how often you're updating the project itself. But generally speaking, I would be careful with using current unless you've got specific functionality you need. So if current has a new feature that adds something that you need for your project, then that's a reason to use current. But generally speaking, my advice is just, if in doubt, stick with the long-term support. The 18 months means that they're only going to push out security updates and things that keep the code current. They're not going to change any major feature sets. So with the LTS version, you've got 18 months where you know that nothing that Node.js does is going to break your current functionality. The second thing I'm going to say is, because there are two versions, there's LTS and current, that doesn't necessarily mean that the projects you're working on are using the most recent versions of either of those. So again, the Volunteer app's a prime example. Volunteer app is not using current LTS. It's using a slightly older version than the current LTS version. And that's fine, because Node's quite happy to let you manage multiple versions of Node on the same server. So you don't have to stick to, say, just the LTS. You can have whatever version you need. But it's not managed very well by Node itself. And because of that, people have put together quite a lot of little bits of software that will support it for you. The two most common is a piece of software called Node Version Manager, which is a script that runs in any terminal applications, so any POSIX terminal, so Bash on Linux, or Windows subsystem for Linux if you're on Windows, or Mac's terminal, it'll run on that. And the second one is a native application called Node Version Switcher. And these just allow you to move about between the two, or however many versions you've got installed. What I'll do is I'll run through these at the end, just showing you how they work, rather than just keep switching between the screens, because that's a bit clunky. So projects can use different versions of Node. There's multiple versions in use. You've got two bits of software that can help you, so NVM or NVS. Personally, NVM is more difficult to install. NVS is quite straightforward. So if you're relatively new to developing, I would probably just install NVS. But if you know what you're doing, NVM's good. And if you're using code spaces, then you don't need to worry about it at all, because NVM is already installed in code spaces.
Dougie, just so you know, your slides aren't in full presentation mode. They're
oh. Right, let's just see there. Right, okay, let's try it again. Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Sorry, my bad. Yeah, that's the joys of sharing screens on Zoom. Cool. So the other thing you need to be aware of as well is the packages yourself. So you've got, that's the real strength of Node, is that you can install all these wonderful packages and you can have multiple versions of them. But this is also something you've got to be really quite careful with. So Node installs packages in two different places, depending on what you tell it to do. It can either install packages locally, in which case, whatever folder you just ran npm from, so when we did the npm express command, it created a folder called Node modules in the folder we're in, and that's where it put everything. That, in most instances, is how you're going to install software, because it's specific to that project. The advantage of that is, if you've got, say, 2 or 3 different projects you're working on, each one can have its own version of a package. So again, I'll go back to the Volunteer app. The Volunteer app is using an older version of one of the icon libraries that doesn't work very well with later versions of Node. So that's fine, because it's sitting in a local directory and it'll always build from that one version. It won't update it unless you tell it to, and it won't interfere with how other packages operate. I tend to find as well, with most of you guys coming in, you guys or girls coming into our teams, that this is the bit they have the most difficulty with, is understanding how npm installs things. So sort of, if you guys like yourself, Martin, it's locally. I would normally try and install things locally. But there is a second option, which is global install packages, and they go into a single folder, one place on your system. So if you install something globally, it will go into one folder for the whole of your computer, and everything that runs will try and run from that package. And even if there's one locally, it will try and use the global one. There's also a third option as well, which is something called npx. npx kind of gets around one of the problems of global packages. So, for example, the Express package that we installed earlier, we probably only ever want to run one command from that package, which is the one that creates the scaffolding. So you, instead of typing in npm and then the command you want to run, you can type in npx, and it will find the package, download it, run the command, and then get rid of the package. So it's never actually interfering with your installation. As most of you are probably familiar with React, npx is the command that you typically use to start a new project with React. So it's npx is worth bearing in mind that if you're in a position where you just want to run something from a package and you don't want to install it, npx is your friend. Which is so important, I decided to put it on the slide twice. You can find a big list of all the packages that are installed using npm, and it's just generally quite good to manage things. But that's the biggest takeaway I would say. If there's one thing you remember from this going away, is packages, install them locally by preference, and by exception, install them globally, because you'll run into a lot of problems. Okay, so happen. So what I'll do is, before we go to questions, I'm just going to switch the screen again and have a quick look at those package management commands so you can see them in use. Cool. So hopefully everybody can see a web browser this time, and I'm not sharing my PowerPoint slides or something else of no use to anybody. So obviously, what we did was we installed npm. So the first thing you can do is you can uninstall things within npm. You can type, and off it'll go. Done. It's gone. And just so you can see it, if you did choose to install Express globally, you just put a little .-g in there, and it installs it. And you can see from the boilerplate that it'll still run just the same. So we've removed Express, installed it globally, and the app should, fingers crossed, still run, which it does. So there you go. Beautiful, cool. I forgot to put pub in the end of it, not bad. The other thing I said I'd look at is a look at NVM as well. So if you type in NVM, it'll give you the commands for usage. So NVM and list is probably the one you're going to use most often. It'll tell you straight away which version you're running on your server. So you can see here the little green arrow. We're currently running on the green one, which is 19.5, which is current. So if you want to change, you can just type in NVM use LTS, and it'll tell you it's not installed. And NVM will also let you install the LTS. So, yeah, you get the idea. CodeSpace doesn't want to run it, but there we go. So I'm not going to bother trying to find another one. I know, okay, it just wants 2 hyphens, happy days. Well, it is installed, we've just done it. There you go. So it's relatively straightforward to use NVM to manage your packages. So if you're now working in a project which you need to be using the long-term support version for, we've just installed the LTS version, switched to the LTS version, and now we're using it. And if you want to switch back to current, I've got a feeling it's just current. There you go. It's switched back. So you've got back NVM current. Happy days. Brilliant. Okay, so I'll go back to my, I'll stop sharing now. So cool. So anybody got any questions? Or do we all just want it to be over?
I'm not sure that's true. Anybody?
One question is how is it best to manage security issues with NPM?
So NPM has a really useful facility, which I will demonstrate for you, which is auditing. It's a good question you asked this, so because I had to do this recently. So NPM audit will run off and tell you what listed vulnerabilities there already are, and it can automatically fix them as well. So I'll just run that again because it's not really clear on that screen. So that's against the current project. So NPM audit, it just tells you what's available there. You may need to screw it up. So you've got a known denial of service. You can follow the link and it'll take you to whatever that, the GitHub ones tend to be quite, it tends to pick up GitHub ones quicker. I think that's because it's running within code space, and they might have. I don't know, but it seems to preference giving you GitHub's CVS above other one. It'll tell you. I mean, it's nicely color coded as well, so you can see straight away that there's 2 high severity ones. You've got a straight audit at the end to tell you there's 4 vulnerabilities, too high, too low, and it gives you an idea of what they are. But what's really useful with this as well is you can, in most cases, you can fix them. This can be a little bit hit and miss, but it's better than most automated tools that I've used. So I'll run it. There we go. So yeah, the automated tools haven't worked, but you can force it as well.
Yeah, I've had to force them quite a few times, but I don't know what risk that has, obviously, if you're breaking.
So yeah, your mileage may vary with using force. For auditing, actually, it depends on what risk you've got. When I've run an audit in the past, what I tend to do is just go away and read the CVSs and decide whether or not I want to accept that risk and how big a risk that is. Because there's so much of a dependent on upstream packages, generally speaking, if there is a high risk, I mean, it depends on how you want to do it. What I tell you is what I do is when I've come across an audit, when I've run it, and there's something which I think is too high a risk, or it's going to be a problem for the software we're writing, is I'll find out whether it's attached to my base code itself or some sort of. So if it's attached to like one of the major Node libraries that are part of the default package, then it's something I need to. It'll probably will pass the automatic audit because there's an awful lot more people working on Node, and Node's, it's proprietary. Well, it's not proprietary, but it's supported and it's sort of well understood. Typically, most of your high severity vulnerabilities tend to be in third-party packages, and if there's a caveat, if there's one thing to be very careful with, is when you're choosing packages, it's worth looking in detail. So, I mean, if it takes something like Express is highly developed. Everybody knows about it. It's got a lot of backing from big companies because GitHub's behind it anyway. You can see the license. There's giveaways that the last published was 4 months ago, so you know it's fairly good before you even run it. But a lot of the stuff that you'll see. So if the date pickers are a good example of this, if there's a date, I'm going to find one that's rubbish. I know there's half a dozen of these don't work very well. This one is a good one. So there's one. It's not been updated for 10 months, but it's quite stable. It's there's a homepage, somebody supports it. This is what I would suggest you probably do. Is you want to really consider whether or not, if the vulnerability's been there for some time, is it a package where then you can just replace it with something else? Because a lot of packages do get abandoned. So you can quite often, and some of the boilerplates aren't updated in quite a long time. So we went through as a game with the volunteer app, we had the same problem. We needed a date picker. The date mechanism was already in the boilerplate, hadn't been supported for about 3 years, and it was full of vulnerabilities. So in that case, the audit is fine. It's just going to tell you to push through. If you decide to use the force option, then it's just down to testing. You'll probably find if you force it, in all honesty, it'll probably be okay, but it might not be. And the whatever bugs you introduce, you're not going to know about until later on. So I'd take caution with the force, and unless it's something you absolutely have to have, I would probably replace whatever module is causing the security vulnerability, or at least get in touch with the developer or look in their boards or whatever to see if it's something that's got, there's a fix coming in the near future. But I mean, on this, that's Express, so it's well supported, and you've got what we've got. We've got an advisory. So if we have a look at the advisory, it's a denial of service. Okay, so in all honesty, the vast majority of exploits that you seem to see in this will probably be denial of service, because it's obviously Node's sitting on a server and it's running in the background. So it makes sense that bots would want to attack that and use that to launch DOSs. Cool. So hopefully that answers your question a bit. And the other thing as well that you'll run into, and Martin, you'll definitely come across this, is that the same thing is true when you try and install some packages. So every time you change the code and you build anything, you're going to run npm install again, because the good thing about npm is it handles all your dependencies, and it handles them quite well. But there is other software. So you may come across people using Yarn. Yarn's another package manager, which is, to be honest with you, is actually slightly better because of how it shows you dependencies. npm's fine until you run into the dependency problem, and then it can be quite difficult to track down which what you need to update or what you need to move. But generally speaking, if packages are installed locally, you probably won't run into a lot of dependency problems. One problem you can run into quite a lot is the way that the package management itself is handled is by using a JSON file, which is this one here, package log, and it just lists. So for this app, it's listing all the bits and pieces you're using. There is a defined standard to how you write these packages, which needs to sit in the repository. I've found that a lot of apps, a lot of packages don't really write these properly. And the problem you run into is they'll tell you, I need this version to run. So they may say, I need Node 18.5. And some of the symbology, like that tilde symbol, that means that I need anything which is version no higher than version 1.9 and it's no lower than version 1.0.1. But any security updates, you can run them on top of it. And the caret means it needs to be at least version 2, and I'll run anything as long as it's not any higher than the next major version number. So that's something just to be aware of, is that a lot of the times that you run into problems with dependencies, it's because whoever owns that package has not really written the package JSON properly. So you often have to go upstream if there's a package problem. However, instead of forcing it, what you can do is you can stick on you can give it another flag, if you like, which is legacy peer deps. And all that'll do is it just ignores it. It'll just, whatever version you've already got installed, it already knows that works with it, and it'll just keep using it. It'll keep, the rest of it will update, but it won't mess about with the one that's causing the problem. So if you get problems with NPM, generally speaking, use the legacy peer deps flag, and it will probably get around most of your problems. Cool. Hopefully that roughly gave you an answer you want to know.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. That was great. Yeah, I've used. It's generally been when I've been sort of testing or trialing something or trialing a package, and I've like just needed it to install, and I've just, well, why is it not installing? So I just end up forcing it just to get it in and get it working. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, generally speaking, I mean, the best advice for that is if it's a package installing, I would go for legacy peer deps first, and if legacy peer deps doesn't work, then I would clear the cache completely and then try and install it again. Sometimes things don't clear out properly from the cache, and then if that doesn't work, then I would just force it. But obviously you're going to have to test it, and that's where the problem comes in. It's down the line. There's no how that is impacted other things. But the takeaway really for anybody that's designing and running Scrum Masters is just when this conversation comes up, we just be conscious of the fact that your best bet is to make sure that you're not picking. It's really easy to go onto, NPM and say, well, look at this one. This is awesome. Look how cool that looks. That's exactly how I want it visually. But overlook that it's not actually been updated in 10 months. It's only ever had 2 people working on it, and hardly anybody's ever built it. So as a developer, I'll be like, no, I did. Yeah. I mean, it's in high, it has, it's 4.6.13, so maybe it's not going to be updated super regularly. It's got at least, 4 point something major version number is probably quite stable, and you've got a home page. So I'll just follow links and have a look about it. It's got documentation. It looks fairly succinct. This is probably a fairly safe bet, but it's been a bit of it's doing that kind of discovery bit when you're picking packages out, because you can end up with something you're really heavily dependent on. But actually, generally speaking, for most of our use cases, I would just steer you towards using one of the bigger frameworks, like React Native. I don't know if have you used React Native when we're talking about native base. I don't know if you've used native base, or if everybody hasn't seen it, I'll just bring up their site. So it's literally just a set of standard default components, and you can just pick out what you need. It responds to me clicking on the docs button.
Excellent. We're going to get you a whole one on native base from you next, Dougie.
No, I wish I'd never found it. But yeah, I mean, something like native base is probably, generally speaking, I would say, but probably stick to these, because things like native base are really straightforward, and that's the real kind of power of Node on top of this. And obviously, this is more heading towards the React space. But so if you've got something like, I don't know, say you needed a checkbox, then it's going to take ages to load. I don't know why the documentation is a bit sluggish. And you can see we've got a standard component, and it's always going to look the same. You can theme it, you know it's going to work and how it responds. There's lots of examples of it. So the native-based is a good example of that. Any framework that's got like quite a dedicated site, lots of documentation, lots of people talking about it, those are the frameworks you're probably going to want to go for. And because it's so easy to install packages, but there's not really any problem with just pulling them down, having a play with them, see whether or not they work for you. And because it might not, there might be something that's just too complicated. Native-based is a big one for us because it handles a lot of the bigger problems within our app. It's things we just don't need to think about anymore, like I don't know, dark mode or how we control themes. So yeah, that's what my main takeaway from that is it's just spend a bit of time with what packages you want to play with and see whether or not they work. Especially because if you deliver mobile in particular, there are a few sort of little funnies between iOS and Android. There are a few things that iOS doesn't natively support, and they've been kind of expanded out. And the same is true for Android as well. Date picker is a big one. The way that Android handles that and the way that iOS handle that are quite subtly different. So you can't just generate the same thing. I'm trying to think there's another one as well. Checkboxes. In fact, checkboxes, that's probably what made me click on it. The way that Android handles checkboxes is different as well. So native-based just takes that. Native-based just takes that away. It's quite well thought out. So yeah, I'd spend a bit of time on discovery for anything you want to put on. But that's more front end, really. I mean, the vast majority of the server stuff, again, with Node is really simple because it is typically simple, and that's the only thing I would consider as well. Is Node the correct solution for your product? And for the vast majority of things that we develop, it probably is, because they're not really much more complicated than creating a database, retrieving some information, or maybe updating a database, or connecting to something, or having a web page served. And in most cases, I mean, the volunteer app's a prime example of that. It's telling people what events are available, and it's telling people what projects are available. It's just client-server architecture. Anything more complicated than that, or anything that involves a lot of concurrency, I'd probably consider other options. Node makes a big thing about being able to handle a lot of concurrency, but I'd be dubious about it because it's not, things like AWS, Azure have got better databasing systems behind them that you can exploit. So, but generally speaking, for most of our apps, it's going to be absolutely fine to use Node. Happy days. Well, if we haven't got any more questions, I guess I'll just end with a look forward. So we have another volunteer who is Node.js-tastic.
Hold on, you're on grey screen again, just so you know.
Oh, okay, if you're cool.
It looked like you're changing.
I was changing, but I've obviously broken it, so I'm just going to stop sharing it. Hopefully. Cool. So I'll just stop sharing altogether then. Yeah, the long and short of it is we've got another volunteer who is all about Node.js and all about teaching, who will be able to give a future presentation with more detail. So the main aim of this really just to give an oversight to everybody of what Node.js actually does. And by showing you code spaces, hopefully, if you want to go away and have a play with it, and you can muck about with NPM or whatever, it doesn't matter. You can't really break it. It's code spaces. If you can completely break it, you can just delete the code space and create a new one. So by all means, go out and play, and it'd be useful generally. So you've got some questions for the next presenter. Brilliant. So thank you for listening to me, and Joanna, over to you.
Brilliant. Right. Thank you, guys. I will share the schedule and when Mike's doing that in more detail talk as well. So we will be looking for, particular areas people want to explore. So please do reach out if there's any things that you get stuck on or any of that kind of good stuff. So lovely to meet those of you who have not met, and thank you for joining us, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers.